For 3 years, I cleaned their offices at night, and in 3 years, not one of them ever learned my name. That is not an exaggeration for effect. It is the literal architecture of my life. And it is the reason I am the one telling you this story instead of being a footnote in someone else's. There is a particular kind of invisibility that money buys without meaning to. And I had wrapped myself in it so completely that I could stand in a room with the most powerful people in that building, 6 feet away, and be less noticed than the painting on the wall. At least they had chosen the painting. I pushed a cart. That was the whole of my disguise. And it was perfect. Because a woman pushing a cart of cleaning supplies through a corporate tower at 11 at night is not a person to the people who work there. She is a function. She is the thing that makes the coffee rings disappear, and the bins empty themselves, and the carpets stay the color they are supposed to be. You do not say "good evening" to a function. You do not lower your voice when it enters the room. You certainly do not wonder what it thinks, or what it reads, or what it remembers. The building was the headquarters of the Halloran Group, 41 floors of glass and steel in the financial district, an investment firm that managed, among many other things, the pension funds of about 90,000 working people who would never set foot in the lobby. Teachers, transit workers, nurses, people who had handed their retirement to the Halloran Group because it was respectable and old and had a marble lobby, and who trusted, the way you have to trust, that the respectable old firm with the marble lobby was keeping their money safe. It was not keeping their money safe. I knew that. I was. By the time this story begins, possibly the only person in the building who knew the full shape of how it was not. And I knew it because I cleaned the offices where the not keeping it safe was being arranged. And because I am a person who cannot enter a room without reading it. I worked the executive floors, 38 through 41, the good shift, the senior cleaners shift, which I had spent 2 patient years earning by being the most reliable, least memorable employee the contract cleaning company had. I came in at 10, when the floors were emptying, and I worked until the building was dark and mine. And I cleaned the offices of the people who ran the Halloran Group. And while I cleaned, I read. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because it is the center of everything, and I'm not ready to show you all of it yet. So I will tell you only what is true, and let the rest arrive when it arrives. When I am in a room, I take it in, all of it, at once. The way you might take in a face, the document left face up on a desk, the figure still glowing on a screen that someone forgot to lock, the note crushed and tossed toward a bin and missed, the sticky tab on a folder, the name on a courier envelope, the total at the bottom of a page someone left in the printer tray because they were in a hurry to get to dinner. I take it in, and I keep it. And the next night, I take in the next room, and the room after that. And slowly, over weeks and months, the pieces that mean nothing alone begin to mean something together. For 3 years, the pieces had been meaning something together. And 4 nights before this story truly begins, on the desk of the Halloran Group's chief financial officer, I read the piece that turned all the other pieces into a picture. And the picture was a crime. And the crime was about to land on the wrong man. His name was Daniel Pierce. I had never met him. I cleaned his office 2 floors down. A small one, a mid-level manager's office with a child's drawing taped to the filing cabinet and a photograph of a woman and 2 kids on the desk. I knew Daniel Pierce the way I knew everyone in that building, which is to say, completely and from the outside. From the artifacts of his life that I emptied and wiped and straightened every night, and on the chief financial officer's desk, 4 nights ago. I had read the plan to destroy him. I put it back exactly as it was. I always put everything back exactly as it was. and I pushed my cart to the next office, and I began. That night, to decide what a cleaner could possibly do about it. Let me tell you what I had assembled. Because the shape of the crime is the engine of everything that follows, and because you should understand exactly how much a woman with a cart can know, the Halloran Group managed those 90,000 pensions, and somewhere in the last 2 years, a great deal of money had gone out of those pension funds and not come back. Not all at once. That is not how these things are done. A single large theft is a flare in the night sky. And the people who run firms like Halloran are not amateurs. It had gone out slowly, in pieces, dressed as fees and transfers and investments in vehicles that existed mostly on paper, routed through enough accounts and entities that following it required either a forensic accountant with a year to spare or a cleaner with 3 years of nights and a head that does not let go of a number. I had the 3 years. I had the head. I had followed it. The money had gone. Ultimately, to benefit a small circle at the top of the Halloran Group. I will not pretend I had every dollar mapped the way I would later. I'm telling you the story as I knew it then. 4 nights in. But I had enough. I knew the funds were short. I knew the shortfall was being hidden by a set of accounting maneuvers that made the pensions look whole on paper when they were not. And I knew, because the regulators had begun, quietly, to ask questions, that the Halloran Group had a problem coming. The kind that ends companies and sends people to prison. So they had done what powerful institutions do when the truth becomes dangerous. They had decided to give the regulators someone, a story, a guilty party who was not them. And the guilty party they had chosen was Daniel Pierce. The document on the chief financial officer's desk, 4 nights before, had been the architecture of it. It was a narrative, essentially, a story being constructed with the cold care of people building a legal case. Daniel Pierce, mid-level manager, had been given, over the preceding 18 months, a series of new responsibilities and system accesses, each one small and reasonable on its own. I had watched it happen without understanding it. I had seen the access change forms in the trash, the new login credentials, the quiet expansion of what one unremarkable manager could touch. I had filed it away as meaningless. It was not meaningless. They had been dressing him. For 18 months, they had been carefully arranging for Daniel Pierce's name and credentials to sit on exactly the transactions that, when the regulators finally pulled the thread, would look like the work of one rogue mid-level employee stealing from the pensions for himself. They had built him a costume of guilt, one access form at a time, and he had worn it without knowing. Because why would a man question being given more responsibility? In 4 weeks, according to the document, the Halloran Group would discover the fraud, express horror, and hand the regulators Daniel Pierce. Gift-wrapped. He would be fired, charged, ruined. The real money would stay where it had gone, and 90,000 teachers and nurses and transit workers would be told that one bad apple had hurt them, and that the respectable old firm with the marble lobby had caught him. I stood in that office 4 nights ago, and I read the whole thing, and I felt something I had not let myself feel in a very long time, which was not surprise, because I had stopped being surprised by what powerful people will do, but recognition, because I had seen this exact machine before. I had seen a firm in trouble reach for an innocent person to feed to the wolves. I had seen a costume of guilt sewn onto someone who did not deserve it. I had seen it from the inside, years ago, and it had cost me everything. And it was the reason there was a woman with a cart on the executive floors of the Halloran Group at all. But I am not ready to tell you that yet. Neither were they ready to know it. I put the document back exactly as it was, and I went home as the sun came up. And I did not sleep. And I began to think about Daniel Pierce and his children's drawing on the filing cabinet, and what a cleaner could do. You cannot fight people you do not understand. So let me show you the three of them. Because they were not the cartoon villains it would be comfortable to make them, they were worse. Because they were real. And real people are harder to beat than monsters. Victor Halloran was the chief executive, 63 years old, the grandson of the man who built the firm, and the most dangerous kind of guilty man, which is the kind who believes he is doing the right thing. I cleaned his office most nights, the corner one on 41, all glass and view and the quiet weight of inherited power. And I had assembled Victor Halloran from 1,000 small artifacts the way you assemble anyone. He was not stealing because he was greedy, or not only. He was stealing because the firm his grandfather built was dying, slowly, the way old firms die, outcompeted and overextended, and Victor Halloran could not bear to be the Halloran who let it fall. The pension money was, in his mind, a bridge, a temporary measure, a thing he would put back when the firm recovered, which it never would, because that is not how these things go. But he needed to believe it, and so he did. I had read his handwriting on the margins of documents, and the handwriting of a man telling himself he was a steward, not a thief. It made him more dangerous, not less. Because a man who thinks he is saving something will do things a simple crook would balk at. Feeding Daniel Pierce to the wolves was, to Victor Halloran, a tragedy he was nobly enduring for the good of the firm. Camille Reyes was the chief financial officer, and Camille Reyes was the one who frightened me. 44, brilliant, precise, the actual architect of the machine. Where Victor needed to believe he was good, Camille had no such need. Camille had looked at the situation clearly, decided that someone was going to be destroyed, and set about making sure it was not her. The plan on the desk was hers. The 18-month dressing of Daniel Pierce was hers. She was the one who understood every number, and that made her the one most likely to notice that someone else understood them too. I cleaned her office last, every night, and I was more careful there than anywhere. Because Camille Reyes was the kind of person who would notice if a folder was 3 degrees off from where she left it, and who would ask why, and who would not stop asking. She had a mind like mine. That was the danger. There were 2 people in that building who could read a room completely and forget nothing. And one of us was trying very hard to make sure the other never knew she existed. And then there was Grant. Marcus Grant, head of building security. And Grant was a different kind of problem, a practical one. Grant was not part of the fraud. Grant was just good at his job, which was knowing who was in the building and why. And Grant had begun, in the last few weeks, to look at me. Not with suspicion yet, with the faint snag of attention a careful man feels when a detail does not quite sit right. The senior night cleaner who had been there 3 years, reliable, invisible, and who was, lately, on the executive floors a little longer than the work required. Grant had not decided anything about me, but Grant had started to see me, and being seen was the one thing my entire life depended on avoiding. 3 of them, the believer, the architect, and the watchman. And a woman with a cart who had 4 weeks to save a man she had never met from a costume of guilt sewn by people who had never once looked at her. I want to tell you I had a plan. That first week, What I had was a picture in my head, nearly complete, of a crime that no one would believe a cleaner could see, pointed at a man who was about to lose everything, in a building where one woman was sharp enough to catch me, and one man was already starting to. What I had, it turned out, was enough. but it took everything I was. I broke my own first rule for Daniel Pierce, and I want to explain why. Because it tells you who I was before I was the woman with the cart, even though I am not ready to tell you the rest. My rule, for 3 years, had been absolute. I do not touch the lives I clean around. I read, I keep, I stay invisible. I had watched affairs and breakdowns and small cruelties and quiet kindnesses play out in the artifacts of that building for 3 years, and I had never once intervened. Because intervention is visibility, and visibility is death for a person like me. I emptied the bins of people whose lives I could have changed with a word, and I said nothing, every night, for 3 years. I broke it for Daniel Pierce because of the drawing on his filing cabinet. It was a child's drawing, the kind every parent tapes up. A wobbly house and a yellow sun and 4 stick figures holding hands, too big and too small. And underneath, in a child's careful letters, my family. I had emptied that office 100 times, and the drawing had meant nothing, the way everything means nothing until it means something. But the night after I read the plan on Camille's desk, I cleaned Daniel Pierce's office, and I looked at the drawing of his family. And I thought about what was 4 weeks away from those 4 stick figures. And I could not make myself stay invisible about it. So I did something small and careful, and against every rule I had. I began to watch Daniel Pierce as a person, not an office. I learned his hours. He stayed late, often. The anxious lateness of a man trying to prove himself, which was its own small tragedy because the proving was exactly what they were using to dress him. I learned, from the artifacts, that the woman in the photograph was his wife, and she was a nurse, and she worked nights too. That they were stretched thin, a young family on a manager's salary in an expensive city. That he had recently, proudly, been telling people about his new responsibilities at the firm, the very responsibilities that were the costume. He thought he was rising. He had no idea he was being fitted for a fall. One night, late, earlier than my floors usually filled, I almost met him. I came around a corner with my cart, and he was there, at the elevator, working too late again. And for a moment, we were just 2 tired people in an empty corridor at midnight. He looked at me. And here is the thing that decided it, the small thing. He said, "Long night. You take care of yourself, okay?" And he meant it. He saw me, for 1 second, as a person, the way almost no one in that building ever had. A tired man being kind to a tired woman at midnight because he was the kind of person who did that. They had chosen to destroy. One of the few people in the building who treated the cleaner like a human being, I said, "You too." And I pushed my cart on. And somewhere in that exchange, the picture in my head stopped being information and became a debt. I was going to save Daniel Pierce. I did not yet know how, but the deciding was done. In a corridor, at midnight, over 4 words of kindness from a man who had no idea he was talking to the only person who could save him. I made my first mistake in the 2nd week, and it nearly ended everything. And it taught me what I was up against. I needed proof I could use. This was the problem that would shape the entire month. So let me be clear about it. I had the whole picture in my head, complete and exact. But a picture in the head of a night cleaner is worth nothing. It is not evidence. It is barely even a story anyone would listen to. If I walked into a regulator's office and said, "I am a cleaner and I have memorized a fraud," I would be thanked and shown the door. And Camille Reyes would hear about it within the day. And Daniel Pierce would be destroyed a little faster. I needed the picture in my head to exist somewhere real. I needed documents, the actual paper, the thing Camille had on her desk and in her files, the architecture of the frame, in a form I could put into the right hands. So in the second week, I began to do something far more dangerous than reading. I began to try to get copies. Not by stealing the originals. Camille would notice a missing document the way you would notice a missing tooth. I needed copies, made quietly, of the key pieces, so that the picture in my head could be backed by paper someone would believe. And the building was full of machines that made copies, and I was alone with them every night. And I thought, in my arrogance, that this would be the easy part. It was not the easy part, because the Halloran Group's executive floors logged everything. Every copy, every scan, every print. Tagged to the access card that made it, and I, the senior night cleaner, had an access card. Because I needed one to reach the floors, and the moment I used a machine, I would leave a record. This card, this document, this time. A cleaner's card, copying the chief financial officer's confidential files at 2 a.m. It might as well have been a signed confession. I learned this the hard way. I made one copy, a single document, the 18-month access change summary that was the spine of the frame. And I made it on the machine on the 39th floor at 2:15 in the morning. And I felt clever for about 11 hours. The next night, Grant was waiting on the 39th floor. He was not accusatory. That was the frightening part. Grant was too good to be accusatory before he was sure. He was just there, where he had no normal reason to be. At the time I usually reached that floor, with the pleasant, unreadable face of a man conducting a test. "Evening," he said. "You're a creature of habit. Same floors, same times, 3 years running. I like that. Makes my job easy." He smiled. "Funny thing, we had a print job last night off a card that shouldn't have been printing executive financials. 2:15, right about when you'd have been on that floor." He let it sit. "You wouldn't know anything about that." And here was the moment that taught me the whole shape of the danger. Because I had a choice in that corridor, and most people would have made the wrong one. Most people would have denied it too fast, or explained too much, or let the fear show. I did none of those things, because I had spent 3 years learning to give that building nothing. And because I understood that Grant did not yet know anything. He was fishing. And a fish that thrashes is a fish that gets caught. "The machines do that sometimes," I said, bored, wiping a sill that did not need wiping. "Print old jobs when you log in to do a new one. Happened to me twice this month. I just clear the tray and bin it. You want me to tell you if it happens again?" It was the right answer. It was helpful, unbothered, and it handed the suspicion back to him as a technical glitch he could choose to believe. I watched Grant weigh it. I watched him decide. Not to clear me, but to wait. Because Grant was patient, and a single odd print was not enough to move on. "Yeah," he said slowly. "You do that. You tell me if it happens again." I said I would, and I went home shaking. Because I had survived. Barely. And because I had learned the lesson that would govern the rest of the month. I could not copy my way to proof. The building's own systems would catch me. Every path that left a record was closed. I needed another way to make the picture in my head real. And the only one left was the most dangerous of all. Because it did not run through machines. It ran through people. Her name was Priya, and she was 26. And she was the first living person I let see even a sliver of what I was. And I chose her the way I chose everything. carefully. From the artifacts? Priya was a junior analyst on the 39th floor. 3 years out of school, ambitious and overworked, and good, genuinely good, at the actual work, which in that building was becoming a liability for her. Because Priya had started to notice things. I knew this the way I knew everything. From the residue of her nights, the printouts she left behind covered in her own annotations, the questions in the margins, the recalculations. Priya Nadar had been handed a set of numbers to work on, routine numbers, and being good and conscientious and not yet cynical. She had noticed that some of them did not add up, and she had started, quietly in her own notes, to ask why. She did not understand what she had found. She did not have the whole picture. She had one corner of it, the way I'd once had only corners. But she had enough to be in danger, because Camille Reyes did not tolerate people who noticed. And a junior analyst asking quiet questions about exactly the wrong numbers was a junior analyst who would soon find herself managed out, or worse, repurposed. Dressed in a little costume of her own, I had watched Priya's questions sharpen over weeks in the artifacts she left behind. And I had felt two things: fear for her, and, slowly, the recognition that she might be the way through. Because Priya had something I did not. Priya had a reason to be looking at those numbers. Priya had legitimate access, a real analyst's credentials, a real analyst's right to request files and ask questions. If the picture in my head could be put into Priya's hands, gently, in the right order, Priya could go looking for the proof through the front door that was slammed shut to me, but to do that, I had to become visible to her. I had to let one person in the building know that the cleaner was not just a cleaner, and every instinct I had screamed against it, because visibility was death. Because the only reason I had survived 3 years was that no one knew I existed as anything but a function. I watched her for a week before I moved, and I chose the moment with care. Late, the floor empty, Priya alone at her desk, surrounded by the printouts of her own dawning suspicion. Exhausted and frustrated and close to the dangerous edge of taking her questions to someone who would destroy her for them. I emptied her bin, and as I did, I said, quietly, not looking at her, in the voice of a function that has never spoken, "The numbers on the Whitfield transfers don't reconcile because they're not supposed to. You're not making a mistake. You're seeing one." She went very still. I had just said out loud, a sentence that no cleaner could possibly have a reason to say. About a set of confidential numbers no cleaner could possibly know. And I had said it to a frightened, brilliant young woman who was now staring at me as though the floor had spoken. "How?" Priya said, very quietly. "Do you know about the Whitfield transfers?" I straightened up, and I looked at her directly, for the first time, the cleaner looking at the analyst as an equal. And I made the choice I could not take back. "Because I clean this whole floor every night," I said, "and I read everything, and I forget nothing. And I have been watching them build a lie in this building for 3 years. You found a corner of it. I have the rest. The question is whether you want to know it. Because once you know it, you can't go back to not knowing. So, do you want to know what's really happening to those numbers, Priya?" And the young analyst looked at the woman with the cart and made her own choice. The one that would change both our lives and the lives of 90,000 people she would never meet. "Yes," she said. "Tell me." I told Priya the truth, in pieces, over a week of stolen midnight minutes. And I'm going to tell you a piece of it now, too, because the time has come, and because you have been patient. And because what I told her about the numbers, I cannot make you understand without telling you who I used to be. I was not always a woman with a cart. 11 years ago, I was a forensic auditor, a good one. The kind of mind that the picture in the head and the never forgetting were built for. Pointed, in those days, at exactly the work they were made for. Finding the money that powerful people hide. I worked for a firm that regulators and companies hired to trace fraud, and I was rising. And I was, God help me, idealistic, in the way you can only afford to be before the world has shown you what it does to people who find things. And then I found something. I was auditing a company, a large one, and I found that its executives were doing almost exactly what the Halloran Group is doing now, hiding a catastrophic shortfall, robbing the people who trusted them, and preparing, when the regulators closed in, to blame someone who hadn't done it. I found it the way I find everything, completely. And I did what an idealistic young auditor does. I reported it, up the chain, through the proper channels, certain that the truth, once seen, would matter. The truth did not matter. The company was powerful. And my firm valued the company's business more than it valued me. And the executives I had exposed reached for the same machine the Halloran Group would later reach for. They needed someone to blame for the irregularities that were now, inconveniently, on the record. And there I was, the auditor who had found them, the perfect costume. They said I had fabricated my findings. They said I was unstable. That I had invented a fraud to make a name for myself. That my own work was the real misconduct. They were powerful, and I was 29, and they sewed the costume onto me with the same cold care I would later watch Camille Reyes use on Daniel Pierce. And they fed me to the wolves to save themselves. My career ended. My name, in the small world where my name meant anything, became a warning. No firm would touch me. I had found a crime and been made into one. And the man who ran the company I had exposed. The man whose fraud I had found and who had destroyed me to bury it was a client and a friend of a younger executive who would a decade later help build the very machine now closing around Daniel Pierce. The world of these people is small. The same hands appear again and again. I did not come to the Halloran Group by accident, and I did not become its night cleaner by chance. And the thread that runs from my ruin 11 years ago to Daniel Pierce's filing cabinet is not a coincidence. But that thread, the deepest one, I am going to hold back just a little longer, because there is one more turn in it that even Priya did not yet know. And it is the turn that breaks the story open. What I told Priya that week was enough. I told her I had been an auditor. I told her I had found a fraud once and been destroyed for it. I told her that I had spent the years after learning the one lesson that ruin teaches, that the truth does not save you, that being right is not enough, that a person who finds a crime and cannot prove it in a form the powerful cannot dismiss is not a hero, but a target. That is why I became invisible. I told her, not to hide from the world, to hunt in it. A cleaner cannot be destroyed the way an auditor can, because a cleaner is no one, and no one is the safest thing to be when you are watching powerful people commit crimes. I had spent 3 years as no one, in this building, assembling the picture, because I had recognized this machine the moment I saw it, because I had seen it before from the inside, because I had promised myself 11 years ago, in the wreckage of my own life, that if I ever saw that machine reach for an innocent person again, I would not report it up a chain and trust the truth to matter. I would do something the powerful never see coming. I would already be inside. Here was the plan Priya and I built, and it was good, and it almost worked cleanly. And then it almost killed us both. The principle was simple. The picture lived in my head. The proof lived in Camille Reyes's files. And the only person who could legitimately reach into those files without triggering every alarm in the building was a real analyst with a real reason. Priya was that analyst. My job was to tell her exactly where to look, so that her requests, when she made them, looked like the natural curiosity of a conscientious junior following a thread, rather than a targeted strike at the heart of the fraud. This is the thing about a frame as elaborate as Camille's. It is enormous. And enormous things have seams. The 18-month dressing of Daniel Pierce had required hundreds of small actions, access changes, transfers, reclassifications, and every one of them existed somewhere in the firm's systems as a record. Priya had the right to request, if she knew to request it. She did not have to find the fraud. I had already found it. She only had to walk up to the exact drawers I pointed at and pull, in an order that looked innocent, until she was holding enough of the architecture that it could not be called a cleaner's fantasy. So I pointed, night after night. The Whitfield transfers first, because she'd already found those, and it was natural for her to keep pulling. Then the reclassification entries, which I told her to request as part of a reconciliation review she could plausibly claim she'd been asked to tidy. Then the access change logs on Daniel Pierce's account, which she could frame as routine housekeeping. Each request, alone, was the boring diligence of a good junior analyst. Together, assembled in the order I held in my head, they were the skeleton of the crime. It worked for 9 days. Priya pulled, and the picture in my head began, for the first time in 3 years, to exist on paper in someone's actual hands. We were careful. We never met where cameras watched. She never wrote my name. We built the case through the front door, a request at a time. And on the 10th day, Camille Reyes noticed. Of course she did. I had always known she would. The only question was whether we would have enough before she did. Camille had a mind like mine, and a junior analyst pulling exactly the threads that led to the center was precisely the kind of pattern Camille was built to catch. She caught it, and she did the thing that nearly ended us, which was that she did not confront Priya. She watched her. I knew it the night I found in Camille's office, a printout of Priya's recent file requests, annotated in Camille's precise hand, with 3 of them circled, and a single word written beside them. Who? Camille had seen the pattern and understood that a 26-year-old junior did not pull those specific threads in that specific order by accident. Someone was directing her. Camille did not yet know who, but Camille was now hunting the hand behind Priya, which meant Camille was now, without knowing it, hunting me. And worse. Far worse. On the same night, I found the other thing, a note in Camille's calendar, of a meeting scheduled with Grant. The architect was talking to the Watchman. The 2 threads of danger I had spent the month keeping separate were about to be braided together. Because Camille wanted to know who was directing her analyst, and Grant had a file in the back of his mind about a night cleaner who was on the executive floors a little too long. It was the worst possible convergence, and I had perhaps days before they found the center of it, which was me. And we did not yet have quite enough. We had most of the architecture. We did not have the Keystone, the single document that tied the whole frame to the people at the top rather than to Daniel Pierce. The one piece that turned a confusing mass of transactions into an unmistakable arrow pointing at Victor Halloran and Camille Reyes. I knew where that document was. It was in Camille's personal files, the locked ones, the drawer she did not leave things out of, The one place in the building my reading had never been able to reach, to get the Keystone. I was going to have to stop being invisible. I was going to have to take a risk that broke every rule that had kept me alive for 3 years. And I had about 4 days to do it. Grant came for me on the third of those 4 days, and this time, he was not fishing. I knew the moment I badged onto the 38th floor and the system did not beep the way it should, the small wrongness a person like me notices the way you notice a missed stare. Then I saw him, sitting in the dark of the empty floor. In a chair he had turned to face the elevator, waiting, with a folder in his lap. Not pleasant this time, certain. "Sit down," Grant said. "We're going to talk, you and I, about who you really are." I did not sit down. I stood with my cart, the function, the no one, and I said, "I have floors to do. The floors can wait." He opened the folder. 3 years ago, you came to the contract cleaning company with a work history I can't verify past about a decade ago. Before that, nothing. A person with no past. I didn't think much of it. Lots of people have rough patches they paper over. But then you started spending too long up here. And then we had that print job. And then, this week, a junior analyst started pulling files that have made the chief financial officer very nervous. And the chief financial officer asked me a question I couldn't answer, which is whether anyone unusual has had access to this floor at night. He looked up at me, and I kept coming back to the cleaner with no past. So I did some real digging, and I found something interesting. You want to know what I found? My heart was very steady. I have learned to make it steady. But I understood that this was the edge of everything, that Grant had pulled the one thread that could unravel me, the thread of who I used to be, and that the next thing he said would decide whether 3 years of invisibility ended here, in a dark office, 4 days from saving Daniel Pierce. "Your name isn't Nadia Cole," Grant said. "Or it is now, legally, but it wasn't always. You changed it 11 years ago, and before that, you were someone the financial world had quite a lot to say about. A forensic auditor who got drummed out for fabricating a fraud investigation. Disgraced, discredited, vanished." He closed the folder. "So here's what I think, Ms. Cole, or whatever I should call you. I think a bitter, ruined ex-auditor talked her way into this building as a cleaner to dig up dirt on the firm. And I think she got that analyst to do her digging for her. And I think the story she's spinning about the Halloran Group is the same fantasy that ended her career the first time. That's what Camille Reyes thinks too. I'm meeting her tomorrow to tell her I found you." And there it was, the whole danger, spoken aloud. Grant had found the surface of the truth, the discredited auditor, and read it exactly the way the powerful had always intended that truth to be read, as proof that I was a liar. The costume they had sewn on to me 11 years ago was still doing its work. All these years later, in a dark office, turning the one person who had found the fraud into the one person no one would believe. I had a choice, and it was the hardest of the whole story. Because Grant was not corrupt. That was the thing. Grant was not part of the fraud. Grant was an honest man who had been handed a lie 11 years old and was about to act on it in good faith. And in doing so, destroy the only chance an innocent man had. I could not beat Grant by being cleverer than him. I had tried that with the print job, and it had only deepened his attention. So I did the thing I had not done in 3 years. The thing I had not done really since the day they destroyed me 11 years before. I told the truth. "You're right about who I was," I said. "You're wrong about everything else, and I'm going to prove it to you. Because you're not one of them. Grant, and I think you know it. You found a discredited auditor. Did you ever wonder what she was discredited for? She was discredited for finding exactly this: a firm robbing the people who trusted it and getting ready to blame someone who didn't do it. I found it once, 11 years ago, and they ended me for it. And now I'm watching the same machine in this building get ready to do the same thing to a man named Daniel Pierce, who has 2 kids and a drawing on his filing cabinet, and who is 4 weeks from prison for a crime Camille Reyes is building around him right now. I stepped closer. You're an honest man doing your job. So do your job. Don't take my word. Don't take Camille's. Look at what the analyst pulled. Read it yourself, with your own eyes, tonight, before your meeting. You're good at finding the truth in this building. Find this one, and then decide who you're going to tell Camille about tomorrow. Grant stared at me for a long, long moment. And then he said the thing that saved everything. The thing that told me I had read him right. 3 years of artifacts adding up to one correct judgment about one honest man. Show me, he said. We had one night and one chance. And Grant, it turned out, had the one thing neither Priya nor I had ever been able to get: a master key. And a reason to use it. And the authority to be on any floor at any hour without a single alarm being raised. I am not going to pretend Grant decided all at once. He didn't. He spent 2 hours that night reading what Priya had pulled. The architecture of the frame. The 18-month dressing of Daniel Pierce. And I watched an honest man's face change as the picture assembled itself in front of him, the way it had assembled itself in my head over 3 years. He checked it. He was rigorous. He did not want to believe me. And he tried not to. And the trying was how I knew that when he did believe me, it would hold. Around 2 a.m, he sat back from the documents and was quiet for a while. And then he said, "This points everywhere except the top. It points at Pierce. Where's the part that points at Camille and Halloran? In Camille's locked files." I said, "The Keystone. The one document that shows the frame was designed, not discovered. I know it exists. I've never been able to reach it." I looked at him. "You can." Grant did not love it. A security chief using his master access to open the CFO's private files is a man ending his own career if he is wrong. But he had read the architecture now with his own eyes, and he was an honest man. And an honest man who has seen what Grant had just seen cannot unsee it. We went up to 41. He opened Camille Reyes's locked drawer with his master key, and I stood beside him. And for the first time in 3 years, I was not invisible. I was a person committing the most visible act of my life. And I read the Keystone over an honest man's shoulder. It was everything I had known it would be. A planning document, months old, in Camille's own structure, that laid out the strategy in language that could not be mistaken for anything but what it was: the deliberate construction of a fall guy. The timeline, the choice of Daniel Pierce specifically because he was mid-level and trusting and expendable. The explicit goal of satisfying the regulators with a sacrifice so the people at the top could keep what they had taken. It was the architect's blueprint, and it tied the whole machine, every thread Priya had pulled, directly to Camille Reyes and Victor Halloran. Grant read it twice. And then he did something I will remember for the rest of my life. The way I remember all of it, because it deserves to be kept. He took out his phone, and he photographed it, every page, with his own credentials and his own authority and his own honest hands. so that the proof would exist not as a cleaner's stolen copy, but as the documented finding of the head of security acting within his rights. "This doesn't leave my possession," he said. "It goes to the regulators and to a lawyer through channels that can't be buried, not your way, the right way, so they can't do to you what they did last time." He looked at me. "You found it, but you're not going to be the one holding it, because the second your name touches this, they'll use your history to bury it, same as before. It needs clean hands." He was right. He understood. In one night. The lesson it had taken my whole ruin to learn. That the truth needs not just to be found, but to be carried by someone the powerful cannot discredit. 11 years ago, I had carried it myself, and they had destroyed the carrier to bury the cargo. This time, the cargo would be carried by an honest security chief with photographs taken under his own authority, and a junior analyst's legitimate paper trail, and a regulator's existing open questions. And the cleaner who found it all would stay exactly where she had always been. Invisible, safe, and, for the first time in 11 years, winning. I promised you one more turn in the deepest thread, and here it is. And it is the reason I did not just save Daniel Pierce, but needed to. Daniel Pierce's full name was Daniel Pierce, but his mother's name, before she married, was a name I knew, because it was the name of the man who had been destroyed alongside me 11 years ago. Not me, the other one. Because here is what I never told Priya and never told Grant. When the firm I exposed 11 years ago reached for someone to blame, they did not reach only for me. They reached for a mid-level employee too. A quiet, conscientious man who had helped me gather the very findings that ended us both. A man with a young family, who was fed to the wolves beside me, and who did not survive it the way I did. The disgrace broke him. He lost everything. And then he lost more than everything. And his family scattered into the wreckage the way families do. And his sister's son, the boy who had been small when his uncle was destroyed, had grown up and changed his circumstances and built a quiet, careful life as a mid-level manager at a firm, trying to provide for 2 kids and a wife who worked nights. Proud of his new responsibilities, with no idea that the machine that had eaten his uncle was about to eat him too. Daniel Pierce was that boy. I had not known it when I started watching him. I had broken my rule for him over a child's drawing. Not a name. I learned the connection later, the way I learn everything. From an artifact, a framed photograph in his office of an older man I recognized with a jolt that nearly stopped my heart. His uncle. My colleague. The man who had stood beside me 11 years ago and not survived. The same machine, reaching for the same family a second time across 11 years. It does that. It does not remember the people it destroys. It only knows the shape of a useful victim. And it had found that shape twice in one family without ever knowing. I knew. And that is why saving Daniel Pierce stopped being a debt to a stranger and became the only thing in my life that mattered. Because I had survived what his uncle had not. And I had spent 11 years as no one. And the universe, or the small, cruel world of these people, had put the nephew of the man who died beside me directly in the path of my cart, in a building I had chosen, in a frame I had recognized. 4 weeks from a fall I alone could see. Some debts you do not get to choose. You only get to pay them. I paid it. You cannot bury a fraud that an honest man has photographed and a real analyst has documented, and a regulator was already half looking for. And the Halloran Group's machine came apart the way these things do once the truth is carried by hands the powerful cannot discredit. It did not happen in a dramatic afternoon. Real reckonings rarely do. They happen in the slow, grinding way of investigations and frozen accounts and lawyers. In the proper rooms, with the proper people, which is exactly how I wanted it. Because the slow, grinding way is the way that cannot be waved off as a disgruntled cleaner's fantasy. Grant's photographs went where they needed to go. Priya's paper trail corroborated them. The regulator's existing questions, suddenly answered, turned into the kind of questions that end firms. Victor Halloran, the believer, who had told himself the pension money was a bridge he would one day rebuild, learned that the world does not grade thieves on their intentions. What happened to him is a matter of record now, handled by the proper people. The firm his grandfather built did not survive, which was the very thing he had stolen to prevent. And there is a bleak justice in that. I will let you feel without naming. Camille Reyes, the architect, fought brilliantly and lost. Because brilliance is no defense against your own blueprint, photographed in your own locked drawer, in your own structure. She had built a perfect machine for destroying an innocent man, and the only flaw in it was that she had never once, in 3 years, wondered what the cleaner was reading. She had a mind like mine. It simply never occurred to her that another one was emptying her bins. And Daniel Pierce. The costume of guilt they had spent 18 months sewing onto him fell to pieces the moment the Keystone showed it had been sewn deliberately. He was not fired. He was not charged. He never knew, for a long time, how close he had come. Because the machine that had been built around him was dismantled before it could close. And you do not feel the trap that springs shut on empty air. He kept his job, then left it, as the firm came apart, for a better one, at a place that deserved him. His kids kept their father. The drawing stayed on the filing cabinet. 4 stick figures holding hands. He learned, eventually, that someone inside the building had seen what was being done to him and stopped it. He never learned it was the cleaner. I made sure of that. Through Grant, who kept my secret as honest men keep secrets, completely. Daniel Pierce believes, to this day, that an anonymous someone in the machine had a conscience. He is not wrong. He just never knew her name. The same way he never knew, in a midnight corridor 3 years ago, that the tired woman he was kind to was the only person alive who could save him. Or that her colleague had once stood beside the uncle in his photograph. Or that 4 words of kindness to a cleaner had, without his knowing, paid a debt across 11 years and saved his whole family a second time. People ask me, the few who know the story, whether it was worth it. 11 years as no one. 3 of them pushing a cart through the offices of people who stepped over me like furniture. A name given up. A life given up. A self folded so small it could fit behind a cleaning cart and go unseen. It was worth it. I will tell you why. And it is the only thing I know for certain after all of it. They built their whole world on a single assumption. The powerful people in that building, and the ones who destroyed me 11 years before them, they assumed that the person emptying the bins is no one. That the woman with the cart does not read. That the function in the corner cannot see, cannot count, cannot remember, cannot matter. They built fraud after fraud, frame after frame, on the certainty that the invisible are also blind. They are not, we are not. The invisible see everything. We see it precisely because no one is looking at us looking. So if you are the one they step over, the cleaner, the assistant, the temp, the function in the corner they speak so freely in front of because they are certain you do not count. I will tell you the only thing worth knowing, the thing it cost me 11 years and a whole self to learn. Being no one is not the end of you. It is the safest place on earth to stand while you watch them, and learn them, and wait. They handed me their whole world, every night, one emptied bin at a time, because they could not imagine I was reading it. I read it, I kept it, and when the moment came, the woman they never saw was the only one who could bring the truth home. Thank you for listening to this story. If it stayed with you, tell me in the comments, have you ever been treated as invisible by people who should have looked closer? Subscribe if you'd like to hear the next one. I'll see you there.